Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mustafa Abedinifar, and I am an assistant professor without review of Persian literary culture and civilization in the Department of Asian Studies at UBC. We're here with you with yet another lecture in the Alireza Ahmadian Lectures in Iranian and Persianate Studies for fall 2021, and this is the one but last lecture in this semester. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge that although we are gathering virtually in the Zoom space, UBC Vancouver is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Today, we're honored to have two guests, one as a speaker and the other one as a discussant. The talk, as you have noticed in the posters, titled New Insights from the East on Poetry and Politics, the Reconciliatory Thought of Saadi Shirazi. Our presenter is Dr. Iman Ahmadian, PhD from University of Newcastle, and our discussant is Dr. Hessam Dehghani, Assistant Professor of Teaching Persian Language and Culture from Asian Studies, the Department of Asian Studies at UBC, a dear colleague and friend. So before going on with more detail in terms of introducing our speaker and discussant, I would like to very quickly mention that this talk is being recorded, and upon the permission of the discussant and the speaker, might be published on YouTube publicly. Also, I would like to, before I forget, to give a big thank you to my own team members, a great team constituting of Kani on and Ms. Nazgul Tawakkulizadeh, who normally helps us with providing closed captioning. Today, however, unfortunately, we do not have a scripted closed captioning. Therefore, we have turned on the automatic closed captioning. If you or anyone who is with you and would like to use transcripts, so please click on live transcript at the bottom of the Zoom. And finally, if you have a question, please save them or just type the questions in the chat box. And if there is a chance, which I'm very positive there will be, then Dr. Ahmadian and or Dr. Dehghani, depending on who the question is for, will be happy to answer those questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker and discussant. Today's presenter, Iman Ahmadian, started his undergraduate studies in management at Queen Mary, University of London, and followed his studies in international relations at the University of Glasgow, Scotland, and later on Newcastle University, England. And later on, Newcastle University, England, where he is currently working as a research associate. He wrote his first book on the diplomatic insights of Saadi's Rose Garden, published in New York by Edwin Mellon Press, and is amidst his second book right now, offering an English translation for the Diwan of Shah Ni'matullah Wali Mahani Kermani, another Persian poet, for which he has now entered into negotiations with Cambridge Scholars Publishers. Iman is very much interested in the Persianate world and what it has to offer the modern age. Today's discussant, Hessam Dehghani, earned his first PhD in linguistics from Allame Tabatabai University, working on the structural analysis and phenomenological study of Persian literature in 2012, excuse me. He then earned another PhD in philosophy from Boston College in 2019. Since then, he has been a postdoctoral researcher and associate researcher at Harvard Divinity School and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, where he has researched about the formation of the Persianate identity in Persian mystic literature. He has published a number of essays in Persian, including Phenomenology of Poetry, rereading Ahmad Shamlu's poem, The Walls. He has also presented on different aspects of Persian mystic literature regularly at Harvard and Boston College. Besides his research interests, He has been teaching English as a foreign language in Iran and Persian and Arabic in North America for the past 20 years. Since 2012, he has taught Persian and Arabic and directed Persian programs single-handedly at Boston College, for which he received both teaching and leadership awards from that institution. He has recently started his tenure as an assistant professor of teaching Persian language and culture at UBC. In pedagogy, Hessam's interests lie in material development and assessment, for which he has passed multiple ACTFL workshops and received several certifications from 2013 up to present. He is passionate about implementing technology in classroom and developing a course book for Persian students of 21st century. With that, I would like to invite our audiences to welcome both Dr. Iman Ahmadian and Hessam Dehghani. And at this point, we are going to have Dr. Ahmadian present his talk. Thank you, Iman.
Good afternoon to all friends in Vancouver. Apparently it's around 4 o'clock there. And I guess good afternoon, good night, and good morning to anyone else from around the world. I'd like to thank Dr. Abedinifar and the rest of the officials at UBC who made this possible, and thank Kani and Dr. Dehghani for their input. All right. Is my voice clear, Dr. Abedinifar?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
All right. Well, I was doing my PhD in Newcastle University, where I saw many peace initiatives, diplomatic methods, peace building methods, or all of them actually, from the West, and a lot of them, or many of them, simply failed. So I thought we should look to the East. And since I was born in England, raised in America, originally Iranian, I thought, why not look into ancient Persia? So you see the title of my book, New Insights from the East on Poetry and Politics, the Reconciliatory Thoughts of Saadi Shirazi. Before I begin, I would like to remember my cousin and good friend, Alireza Ahmadian, who is with me and the rest of our family in our hearts always. Here you see I've made some kind of a, I guess, aesthetic diagram. Niccolo Machiavelli to the right, the father of realpolitik and realism in international relations, which focuses on rationality and using the mind and utilitarian ethics in global affairs. On the left, you see Michelangelo, one of the icons in aesthetics, and in the middle I've put Saadi Shirazi. There's a reason for this diagram. What Saadi has done is he has merged aesthetics and politics into his rose garden and offered a different utopia from many books about utopia and how a new social political order can be achieved for a utopia. Saadi has merged some of Michelangelo's views on aesthetics, some of Machiavelli's realistic and practical views on politics. And this is basically, this diagram shows what I have done in the book, really. Aesthetics and politics. My first question here is, are they in clash? Well, not necessarily. Why I say this, they both create worlds. Political parties are trying to create worlds. Aesthetics also, poetry being a music, even being various components in aesthetics. They try to create a world. Anyone listening to music, anyone reading a piece of poetry is in a new dimension of reality. And this leads us to the second issue of imagination. Political parties, political movements such as Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, they always show a promised land, some kind of utopia, and they use the power of aesthetics to inspire imaginary motion in the human mind. Poetry, if you look at Shelley from England or Anna Akhmatova from Russia or our own Saadi Shirazi in Persia, they always have this sense of imagination and what could life be like. producing meanings very related, if not the same, to the creation and imagination. If you look at the Brexit Party in the United Kingdom, they produced various different and new meanings of what a United Kingdom away from the European Union could be. Poetry is not different. They produce new meanings, especially when it comes to ethics. What is right? What is wrong? Constitution of identity. Belonging to any political movement does constitute an identity, while someone reading poetry engages with himself, and this raised level of consciousness constitutes a new identity, whether with himself or between himself and the world. The issue of relations follows. How do I see myself in this world? Who am I in this world? Political parties, political movements, same with poetry and making sense of the world. Poetry offers a different social political order, and it does it without doing it directly. It does it in an aesthetic manner, subtly, while perhaps political movements do it in a more doctrinal and dogmatic manner. But so they're not necessarily in clash, aesthetics or its component, poetry and politics. Both also provoke. Poetry, like for example, the constitutional revolution in Iran, where various poets provoked nationalist sentiments among Iranians. Political parties, like the Brexit Party in England, also provoked. Issue of emancipation, freedom from the forces of coercion, whether religious, social, or political, that have defined our domain in the world we're living in. Poetry, because it uses rhyme and aestheticism, it offers a domain where the reader simply leaves the world. And politics also offers freedom. They are both a mirror of society. Poetry does mirror society, so do politics, especially populist movements, at least claim to offer salvation, utopia, both. Criticize. In this area, perhaps poetry criticizes the social and political order much more than politics. But again, political movements like the one started by Karl Marx, they do, or the one started by Mao in China, yes, they do criticize. Play on human emotion, this is an obvious, both of them. Are they in harmony? Poetry and politics, are they in harmony? Well, not necessarily. Aesthetics criticizes politics, and Akhmatova criticized the purges and the brutalities that were happening in Russia during her time, which made her a fugitive. Very famous political poet. Power views poetry or aesthetics, film, as a nuisance because it actually does offer some level of expression. And the reason aesthetics or poetry or film or other components of aesthetics allow this expression is because they don't directly criticize the prevailing order. So you have some level of maneuverability. Offering safe resistance to the state, that's precisely what I said. Poetry does that. Politics does not necessarily offer that. Probably, I don't know if it ever does. The issue of next, again, still are we in harmony? I'm saying no, politics can shape aesthetics and place bounds on it. Yes, in Eastern Europe, we saw how the Eastern Germany, I apologize, in East Germany during the Cold War, we saw how theater and cinema had constraints on it. Aesthetics shaping politics and forming it. Well, let's look at the aesthetics of Confucianism and the aesthetics of Chinese mythology, which both Mao used to form a new political domain in China against the Western imperialism. At times, politics does use aesthetics for legitimacy. How does CNN make an invasion to Iraq and Afghanistan look like a very sound, legitimate endeavor, to a point that even the genocide of more than 1 million people actually looks like, well, everyone's doing their duty. They're there to spread freedom and actually free the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, they did free them by, unfortunately, causing their deaths. So politics has used some form, and aesthetics in my presentation for the purpose of this talk is the study of sensation, emotion, feelings, beauty, and human subjectivity. Aesthetics is not the issue of just studying beauty. Politics has used aesthetic themes in order to legitimize its actions. Here are two quotes. My favorite from President Kennedy, where he actually offers a practical, I guess, notion of why politics and poetry are together. If more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I'm convinced the world would be a little better place in which to live in. We have on the right here, Shelley, my favorite English poet. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, I like what Shelley says because Shelley says poets are the unacknowledged and legislators. Legislators meaning they're lawmakers. Poets actually make laws, but unacknowledged because poets are not seen to directly make social or political laws. What they do is, through their poetry, they penetrate human consciousness, and without knowing, humans are behaving to a certain extent the way that poets intended to. Going back to his picture here, yes, Shelley actually believed poets must reshape social and political order. This is a long quote. I'm gonna, by Bland, a wonderful Persian studies expert, and he describes what poetry is, with how poetry and politics link in Iran and the history of Iran. It's long, but it's quite eye-opening. The history of the Persian poets is the history of the Persian nation. Okay, there's identity. It is the biography of their greatest men whose lives, whose actions, whose feeling, and whose tastes are all, in a greater or less degree, associated with poetry and influenced by poetic impulse. Well, there's the influence of poetry in Iran and for Iranians. This influence was exercised over the highest potentates by the most subordinate of their subjects. This shows that poetry has been used as a tool to have some sort of power over those who are more powerful than you. Their graver historians supply countless anecdotes of men exalted to rank and power and enjoying the unlimited favor of their sovereign by this sole merit. Shows the value of poetry by people in politics in Iran. Lives have been sacrificed or spared, cities have been annihilated, or ransomed empires subverted or restored by the influence of poetry alone. This statement, I'm not sure, but I think it's maybe a little bit rhetorical. Nevertheless, it shows how poetry and the position of poetry in Persian history. Armies levied to avenge the insult of an epigram have been disbanded at its Palinodia. The prison has opened its gates to the ingenious offer of an important impromptu. Stanzas have saved a suppliant's life, and a well-turned compliment in verse more than once soothed a breast in which dwelt all the undisciplined passions of Eastern despotism. Now, all of this fancy words at the end, it shows poetry has been able to change outlooks, whether this outlook is someone in power, whether this outlook is your prison guard apparently, or whether this outlook is the revenge you wanted to take because another poet on the other side actually has said something against your values. Pardon my. Well, this is me, and this is the book I wrote to show my professors during my time in Newcastle University how the East, especially Persia, has offered solutions in reconciliation which can be much more effective than the more Eurocentric and Western-centric options available, which have failed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and many, many more. It was published while I was in Newcastle University by Edwin Mellon Press in New York. And this is the point I want to get to. The whole project started not as a matter of Iranian studies. It started in peace building, where scholars from Manchester University, such as Oliver Richmond or Roger McGinty in Durham University, stated that we need new peace building methodologies, one that are not imposed on the indigenous population, where they can evoke colonial memories, do not take into account indigenous desires, customs. They cause resistance, and they're unsustainable, as we recently saw in Afghanistan. After decades, the Taliban came back in power because the world or the Western world's state building structure did not sustain itself. Contemporary Iran, the issue of, we have a similar, now the case I was working on in my book was contemporary Iran and the clash between the religious and national identity in Iran, and see whether this clash can be fixed by Western imposed structures or local structures. And that's where Saadi comes in. The current clash in Iran between its religious and national identity is a big one. It affects foreign policy, that affects Iran's relation with itself. The issue of national reconciliation has come up again and again in various newspapers. And that's where I got the idea that Saadi himself can be an enabler here. Since Saadi, as it says here, he has been in Persian he has been in Persian life for centuries in the school system. He is a living phenomenon, and not just Persian poetry being a living phenomenon, Saadi himself, because Saadi preserved the Persian tongue during the Mongol invasion. He, subconsciously or consciously, has a huge effect on Iranians, whether they're on the nationalistic side or the religious side. He has actually been known by one Iranian scholar as the poet diplomat. As I said, he preserved the Persian language during the Mongol invasion. One scholar of Iranian studies, I forgot the name, actually says that 400 of Saadi's expressions in his Rose Garden and other books are used still today. And another scholar uses the figure 2000. So he is a poet that is alive. For example, Shah Nematullah Vali, although he has a movement, a Sufi movement called Nematullah, he's not as alive as Saadi. Saadi is also evoked in various political and social discourse in Iran, and various, from the interviews I did from various officials, he has come up even on the media. He is quite alive. Saadi shaping the psyche of Iran. Now, his book and his writings have been in the curriculum within Farsi schools and Farsi classes. Saadi has been known to offer a very clear Persian language, a very clear, easy to understand Persian language. Even there was one scholar who pointed to Saadi as, I forgot the names because too many names are on my mind, as the architect of modern Farsi, Saadi being the architect of modern Farsi. And all of these give weight to Saadi for being the poet diplomat that can possibly fuse the religious and nationalistic sides of the Iranian clash today. Issue of unity of entity, in my view, has not been one that Saadi has used a lot, although there are different views. He is not the typical Sufi, as you know, in Attar Neshaburi or Rumi. He is different. His unity of entity and the way he wants to link various entities in the world have a more practical side than a mystical side. Saadi is always in his writings trying to balance or link between realism and idealism. His Rose Garden itself is a utopia. He wants to take the reader to a utopia where human integration has caused people to coexist. And 5 main principles that I saw in the Rose Garden, justice, decency, human disposition, and rationality, and bonding. These are the principles I saw that Saadi has used to create a utopia. Nevertheless, Saadi has verses that some consider contradictory. I don't. I call them anti-reconciliatory verses, where he actually, in my opinion, he is trying to protect this utopia. And the reason is because Saadi is a man of the world. He is not your typical Sufi who sits in a corner and prays. He has been in the Crusades. He has been in the Mongol invasion of Persia. The man has been around, basically. And that's why perhaps his balancing act between self-interest and social altruism, between realism and idealism, between moral principles and statecraft, has a much more practical sense. And those verses that become anti-reconciliatory, where Saadi becomes even violent, aggressive, they are there just to protect his utopia, his rose garden. As I read the Rose Garden, God knows how many times, roses alone cannot make a utopia. Roses are human entities, political parties, organizations, races, ethnicities, sects, religions. Roses alone do not make a rose garden. When they're integrated, then the rose garden comes about. And Saadi has verses that describe, based on justice, decency, disposition, rationality, and bond, to make this utopia and use these 5 principles as instruments for humans to come together, but also has verses which are very, very aggressive if anyone likes to harm this utopia. And I use the analogy, the roses are the utopia, coming together, the people basically. The soil that keeps this garden are the 5 principles that Saadi uses to build this utopia, and the thorns on the roses are his anti-reconciliatory verses. Saadi does use unity of entity in a more practical way than other scholars. The issue of Iranian and Islamic identity. Well, how does Saadi balance that for the case studies purpose on modern day Iran? Well, he himself is a perfect example of the Iranian/Islamic identity icon in Iran. He is patriotic. His verses clearly state that, but he was raised as a Muslim. And throughout his verses, he has used Islamic themes, Persian themes, even themes that can be seen as somewhat Western or modern, interchangeably, in a manner that it's almost difficult to find out where his religious themes begin and where his Persian themes begin. His book is integrated. For example, he uses around 40 themes from the Islamic Hadith and Quran, while also pointing to great Persian icons such as Bozorg Mehr, and pointing to writings in Avesta, the book of the Zoroastrian religion of Iran before the Arab invasion. So, but he does it in a beautiful aesthetic mix that basically there's no clash. That's why I picked Saadi as the poet diplomat. As I said, his poetry not only echoes Iranian themes, Islamic or religious themes, some issues that can easily be seen as Western themes, modern matters, issues of, now this is the controversy, human rights, if you believe, it is quite a controversial topic whether Saadi discusses human rights and civil liberties, which are associated nowadays with some Western nations discourse. Nevertheless, what he does is, because he's been called the quintessential Muslim humanist, he believes human identity having priority over all religious, sectarian, ethnic, or racial identities. He can build this utopia if his prescription based on humanism is actually adhered to. This rose garden full of roses together is not an ideal. It can be a reality, but as all scholars, he can only offer the prescription. Yes, I have gone through matters of realism and idealism. One thing that Saadi actually is very appealing to various sides in the current Iranian conflict or anywhere in the world is because Saadi has traveled a lot. His verses, which are more in an advisory role, are very based on daily endeavors, conflicts, disputes, judges, thieves, marriage, love, failed marriage, his own failed marriage, war. And it's very practical. So he can appeal to anyone from any side of any divide, not just Iran. His verses have a tendency of, I use the analogy, mirror, where anyone reading his verses, reading Saadi's poetry, can see what they're trying to find. So when I read, I see something that I'm trying to find, while another reader reads his verses, he sees his or her own image there and sees what he was looking for. So I use the term mirror to describe his verses. Now, this could be due to some of Sa'di's Sufi and mystic influences, where man is supposed to be non-existent, and whatever man see is the beauty of the divine. Not to go deep in spectrum and physics, but the only color that is non-existent and doesn't have a color is the mirror. And the reason mirror can show any image is because it has no color. So if you look at Sa'di, and my analogy linking poetry to physics, apparently, Sa'di does offer a mirror and we can see ourselves in it. Yes, the issue of ease. Sa'di is not only, as one scholar noted, the architect of modern Farsi, he also brings a Farsi which is easier to understand compared to other poets. And there is a multidimensional nature to his writings where diverse audiences can enjoy. The matter of international relations and politics, which I have pointed to, I will reiterate here in more detail. Realism, the doctrine which uses the mind and calculations and material entities, material considerations, dominates in international relations and global politics. Sa'di does use the mind, but he also uses emotions. For example, when he is trying to build a utopia, he doesn't just build it with some beautiful humane principles. He also gives a notice to the reader that the world is brutal, and he adds his anti-reconciliatory verses to protect this utopia, which I have mentioned already. Some have considered Sa'di's anti-reconciliatory remarks as contradiction. I do not. I mentioned failures of Western state building, which is based on the more material, rational paradigm called realism. In Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq and Afghanistan, massive failures. In Iran, we have 4 decades of sanctions, achieved nothing. Instead of 4 decades of sanctions, which is perfectly in line with realist thinking in international relations, maybe, if I am the entity placing the sanctions, and I'm trying to coerce Iran to do something, maybe I study Iran. Maybe I use indigenous themes to appeal to Iranians. Maybe I use local values to appeal to Iranians instead of using this carrot and stick. If you do it, sanctions are off. If you don't do it, you suffer, which 4 decades has proven not to work. People like Sa'di offer those indigenous themes to anyone who wants to engage with Iran, especially since Sa'di has a very beautiful integration of Iran's religious and nationalist dimensions. Nowadays in Iran, we have, as I said, the people who identify themselves with more Iran's pre-Islamic history, the more nationalist sides, and the post-Islamic history, the more religious. However, both respect Sa'di. I have mentioned that Iran does require a fusion of this fracture between identity, and I have mentioned how Sa'di can offer it. Yes, my book, which you saw a picture of, was basically investigated Sa'di's poetry to discover reconciliatory lessons for the nationalistic religious clash in Iran, which has been a huge socio-political issue affecting its domestic and foreign relations. Before I go to people who have been influenced by Sa'di, whether domestic or foreign, I would like to say there's a section in my book which clearly mentions how Sa'di has echoed themes by Plato, Socrates, and Western thinkers, and how his humanistic approach, because Sa'di, okay, even if we put aside Sa'di's Islamic themes and nationalistic Persian themes, Sa'di's main theme is his humanism, which can be used anytime in any place, and it's perennial. We had a challenge in this investigation whether a writing from centuries ago can be used today to help political problems today, where scholars like Skinner from Queen Mary University of London believe no, writings are only contextual and can be used only in their immediate time and place. On the other side, we have Lovejoy, who believed no, some writings following the great text tradition are perennial and can be used thousands or centuries after the writing. In this, I guess, in this bipolar status, in the middle, we have, in this continuum, we have people like Trump, who agree more with Lovejoy and say history is repeating itself. So we can indeed use writings like Sadi or Hegel to fix problems nowadays. We also have people like Romano, who actually bring a very amazing point and saying there are certain writings that create worlds. Now, this was at the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned it, writings that create worlds. And for example, the writings of Karl Marx, which he created a world. And even today, although we don't have communism that much anymore, still his writing has appeal and his concerns are still echoing. Saadi's social justice still echoes today in the world and is a perennial issue. As Lovejoy states it, it is a perennial issue that will always stay with us. Issues of justice, issues of moral, ethical issues. And that is why maybe Hegel, one of the people who has been influenced by Saadi, refers to Saadi's writings as a Bible of ethics. This is Hegel right here and refers to Saadi's writing as a Bible of ethics. It's amazing. These are various people from President Obama, top right, to Alfred Tennyson on the top left. What's noticeable here for me, actually, at least, is at the bottom, we have Nicholas Leonard Sadi Carnot, one of the fathers of thermodynamics, and his name is Sadi because his father actually named him Sadi because he was in love with him. On the left, we have Marie-Francois Sadi Carnot, a former French president who his father named him Sadi because he was so influenced by him. If you look, we have Alexander Pushkin over there, Benjamin Franklin. I'm not going to go to detail, Edgar Allan Poe on the top. And somehow they were influenced or enjoyed or inspired by Sadi's writings. The Persian poet, actually, Khajuh Kermani, who also had some dealings with his writings and his thoughts. Alan Eyre here we have to the right, a State Department official, and President Carter on the left, which actually read a piece of Sadi when he was meeting, I think, with Iran's former king, the Shah. I would like to thank Alireza Ahmadian, my beautiful cousin, who is living in my heart and everyone else's heart from all the people he touched. This is one of the people who actually physically and practically, not like me in theory, in practice, went after Sadi's Rose Garden, tried to bring people together. And he linked Iranian culture, whether Iranian culture before Islam or after Islam, which you see two pictures of it to his left. On the top, we have Sadi's mausoleum, which is Iranian culture after Islam. And the bottom, we have the Achaemenid Empire, Persian Empire at the bottom, the symbol, Iran before Islam. Alireza always tried to link these two parts of his identity with other identities, Colombian, the Canadian. And I guess in my heart and the people who met him, he did plant a small rose garden. And that is why people like this, they're always remembered. I wrote in Farsi, Zende bad Alireza yadat gerami, which is long live Alireza, and you will always be remembered. The rough translation. I would like to thank all of you and give the floor back to Dr. Abedinefert.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmadian. Thank you very much for remembering Alireza, who will definitely be remembered all the time. So Iman Jan, thank you. And so at this point, I would have loved to, if you have time, I invite you to please just maybe do this. And if you have them ready, like, are there also examples of Sadi's words and Sadi's works that you would like to share with us? I know that out of respect for our sort of the time restraint, you might have sort of shortened your talk, but are there like examples as well of those 5 pillars and then the anti-reconciliatory, the thorns maybe, or? Okay.
There are, I have to, I don't have them ready right now with me. The 5 pillars, for example, the issue of disposition, where Saadi talks about how a person's temperament, a which is actually a natural feature that we might have. One person is less patient, one person is more patient. How Sadi refers to how someone's temperament can lead to human coexistence much more than someone who's impatient. This is the issue of disposition. On the issue of, let's say, rationality, and he mentions beautiful phrases about before throwing an arrow to a castle, think about how many arrows are coming back to you. And this is the issue in strategic thought, that you think about consequentialism. And he brings rationality to show how it's necessary for a utopia. And we see examples of hardline behavior in modern politics, which, because they didn't listen to him, you do something, you feel good, and then so many destructive consequences come. I guess Trump might have been an example of very rash behavior. In terms of his anti-reconciliatory discourse, the thorns of the roses, if you will, the one that I believe he has used to protect his utopia, he does have verses where simply blood and swords are there. He has verses where he says, do not be kind to a person who you know your kindness will be perceived by him as a weakness. He has a limit, and that section, his anti-reconciliatory remarks, are there to protect his utopia. He goes on to say, for example, at one part he says, share your thoughts with your companions because these companions are there for you, and so forth. Then another party comes out and says, don't share everything with companions because you never know which day a friend becomes an enemy. Now, many people see this as a contradiction. I don't. He's just integrating his idealism with realism. Why not? Why not? We have to be careful. At the same time, we're trying to coexist with others. We have to know that not everyone wants to coexist with us. So yeah, these are issues. Actually, I would like to, if we have time, I mentioned one scholar said 400 and another scholar said 2,000 of his expressions are used daily. One expression in Farsi, kolata min zehava, or throw my hat in the air out of happiness. This came from Sadi. And it's used in Farsi today, in modern day. Another expression which is even used in the West, know your audience. Hekayat bar, he says it in Farsi, say your statement, your story, your case, according to the disposition of the person who's hearing your case. And this comes today even in the West, know your audience. I haven't been able to identify 2,000 with all honesty, but 400 I can believe. It needs more research.
Thank you, Iman, for the further clarification. At this point, I invite Dr. Dehghani and Dr. Ahmadian to have their conversation together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa John. Thank you, Iman John. And thank you, everybody, for being the audience of this session. I am I'm at UBC in Point Grey, the traditional and ancestral unceded territory of Musqueam people. And I make some very introductory remarks and mostly ask a couple of questions. So I ask a question and I seek clarification and let Iman describe the project even further, and then asks the second question, and hopefully in 10-15 minutes, and let the audience participate in the discussion as well. So my humble questions are just aimed at introducing Iman's perspective and his book, and only on the side about his views on Sadi himself and the whole oeuvre of Sadi. And also mostly in order to show what he has said in the book, as Mustafa said, to bring some concrete examples, and also to see the points that are left unthought or unmentioned. So let me begin by this question of civilization. So you mentioned a number of times in the book, the word civilization, and civilitas, civil. It has its on its root a certain meaning, a certain systematic meaning that is civilization. And you say that this book, you compare rose garden, or as I would like it to call flower garden, as civilization. So what do you mean by civilization, if you clarify? And what are the components of civilization that you think Saadi himself is able to come, meaning Saadi with his kind of coming from in a certain age where it's very distant from our time. So how do you think that this civilization has things to say to us?
Well, a lot of questions on that. The issue of definition of civilization.
Yeah.
If we want to consider Mesopotamia, the first civilization, somewhere between Iran and Iraq, mostly Iraq, they called it a civilization because humans could work together to achieve a collective aim. The issue of civilization in my book, it comes up a lot, and the reason is the Islamic and Persian civilizations almost in a clash in modern day Iran. Saadi's view of civilization, at least in the Rose Garden, at least as I've studied it, is he sees civilization as a place of coexistence. If coexistence occurs, he will, again, this is just my interpretation of his thoughts, he will definitely refer to it as a civilization. Where now, and sometimes this, when I was studying Saadi, I had to compare it to various international relations paradigms, and there was one where you agree to disagree. And I was thinking how Saadi would have thought about that, agreeing to disagree at this time. So yes, if there is coexistence, it doesn't have to necessarily be love between human entities being organizations, movements, religions, political parties. But as long as coexistence is there, I would say Saadi calls it a civilization. On the issue of how Saadi's world links to ours, well, he was taken captive as a slave during the Crusades. He saw that, where unfortunately Muslims and Christians were simply killing each other over a land. He saw people killing each other when the Mongol invasion came. These two profound incidents really shaped his mind. And when I was doing this project, I had to use Collingwood's idea of history. Collingwood is a wonderful, wonderful historian. He was very young when he became such a notable philosopher, and he demanded the readers to read texts not in context in terms of physical context like Skinner, but study the mind processes of the individual when he was writing. That was almost impossible to study Saadi's mind when he was writing The Rose Garden. However, an educated guess can be made that how the Mongol invasion of Persia and how the Crusades led this man to become a fanatic of coexistence. And I guess from this uncivilized behavior that time between Muslims and the Crusaders, Muslims and Christians fighting over the Holy Land, so much innocent blood being spilled, and the Mongol invasion of Persia, where if it weren't for Saadi, the Persian language would have been lost. I think out of that, Saadi brought up this idea of Rose Garden and coexistence, and civilization is where we don't have things like this. Even if we can even despise each other, but we can still live together as neighbors. So we don't agree. Okay, fine. We're not supposed to be in love, but we can not commit to violence. So this issue was quite interesting for me. And I think there's an expression in Persian language, and Saadi also alludes to it in his writing. It's used today. And who did you learn morals from? I learned it from the immoral. So adab az ka mukhti az biadaban. Saadi learned coexistence being the pillar of any civilization from uncivilized behavior of humans. I hope that answers the gist of it. If not, please, I'm happy to conclude.
That's great. That's great, and thank you for your allusion to the to that. Beautiful verse. And I really like this idea of reconciliation, and especially I want you to elaborate on the relationship between Sadi's writing in these terms as well, because he has on the one hand Gulistan and Bustan are very moral works, ideal or real. They are very moral and ethical. And on the other hand, he has obscene works too. He has lyrical and obscene and very vulgar language even too. So can you elaborate on that too? How do you think that reconciliation is relevant there?
Yeah, this was asked of me in other seminars as well. The vulgar language is even in Rose Garden sometimes, and to a point that some might not want to read it, or even it delegitimizes all the beautiful language. Reading over and over various Sadi scholars from West and East, I believe Sadi wanted his work to be a mirror of the world. I believe he was the mystic who didn't want to be sitting in an empty room praying. So Sadi showed that even himself has flaws. Even himself is a human. Even the person who's asking for reconciliation and is criticizing human beings for their misdeeds, he himself is a human and he has misdeeds. So he's showing, I guess, the unaesthetic side of human nature and the world which he experienced. He had a failed marriage, affected him badly. He was a slave, affected him badly. He saw vicious acts by the Mongol hordes, affected him badly. This is one account that I have about, I think Sadi simply wanted to show that he is human, nothing more, and he can be vulnerable to rage, to impatience, like all of us are. And also, second, he wanted to show this world is not all roses. This world is not all roses, and we need those thorns. At times we need those thorns to fight off forces that want to destroy our rose garden. And thorns are not pretty. That's why they're thorns. Another issue now, because this really came up in another seminar, was I think that Sadi's writings are not planned. Sadi's writings are in a flow of emotion. They're not planned as, that's why he never offered a systematic treatise on the political thought. Unlike a political ideologist like Karl Marx, or a political theorist like Machiavelli, or a political philosopher like Hobbes, Sadi is not systematic. And he allows a flow of emotion, all the experiences of his life that are built up in him, to empty on paper in his poetry. So one is the flow of emotions. There's writing, it's not sad, there's no plan there. Another is mirror of the life, and another showing that he himself is a human with misdeeds and all kinds of impatience and hate and greed and vulnerable to all of these.
Why don't you take it a little bit even further to say that actually reconciliation is happening when we come to terms with our body, with our limitations, right? So even bringing body and bodily desires to the fore is a sign of him being reconciliatory, being a realist who wants to bring the whole human machine to the fore, to accept, to reconcile it, right? Reconcile the religion with body, the religious desires with bodily desires, and the rest. I think he is the master of language, so he should have put some energy into crafting the language as well. It cannot be just flow of emotion, although there is a lot of inspiration obviously to it. But I want to go to now to some of the things that you mentioned and some of the things in the book. So you mentioned this word again, utopia, and Gulistan as utopia. As we know, most of these notions of utopia, in these prescriptions of utopia, starting from Aristotle, from Plato's Republic, they have ended up in disastrous results. Starting from Plato's Republic, with the massive killing of people in order to build that just city in the speech. Socrates gets rid of a lot of families. That's he's infamous for that massacre right there. Most of the plans, or as Jean-Luc Nancy says, operations of community, as we see in Marx or in Stalinist Russia, in Marx, in communism, and in most of these projects, let's say, of operative community, of utopias, have ended in disaster. What do you think Saadi offers us to immune us from that kind of exclusive community and that kind of we say homogeneous community?
Well, I think you answered part of your question before, and something that I even forgot to mention. Saadi, before demanding reconciliation in others, he has done it with himself, admitting to his own flaws and his own weaknesses. So one benefit that he offers, I mean, compared to, I guess, Stalinism or what Marx did or what others did when they wanted to create a better world, and all of them ended up in disaster, and destruction and pain. Saadi does show himself as a man who has flaws, not as some saint, not as some savior. He never shows himself as a savior, actually. Even at the end of his Rose Garden, he does say, my work is a prescription. Take a page if you like, and it can help you. He never dictated anything that I have the answers. He never showed himself as a messiah or a prophetic figure. So he does show his human vulnerabilities, and that's what you refer to. And that is the point where he is reconciling with himself first, before he asks others to build this utopia of reconciliation. So that is one point where he actually is unlike Stalin as being or Mao, seeing even today in North Korea, their leader being seen as a cult figure. He never even brings himself close to that. So his egotism, there's nothing there, it doesn't exist. Or he shows, by showing that he has flaws, he shows that his egotism is either under control or acknowledged. That's one step. Second step is his idealism, unlike Karl Marx, has a lot of practical sides to it. I mean, he brings one anecdote, he advises, then he brings the next anecdote, and he says, at times we need blood and sword and this and that. He says, yes, trust your neighbor, do this to your neighbor, help him. And another story, he comes out and says, if your neighbor doesn't repay the trust you give him, just cut the relationship. So he does bring, as you said, vulgarity or unaesthetic themes in his writing. And so I would answer your question as two. One, not having a cult figure for himself, admiring his flaws, not being egotistic. Two, the issue of practicality. And three, which is related to both of them, is that, remember, he never actually asks people in a strong manner to please follow me. And I'm repeating myself. He only offers a prescription. If you want, choose. If not, don't choose.
And that's right. So, but again, prescriptions can be. So if you follow my prescriptions, Socrates said in the Republic, you will have the just city. You will have this utopia, right?
Yeah.
What does Saadi say instead?
Interesting. Saadi doesn't say it. Saadi never even uses the word utopia. Even the word rose garden, Golestan, the name of the book, it is my interpretation that his intention was utopia. He has never directly or explicitly, openly said anything that my prescription will take you somewhere. He says at the end of it, take a page of my rose garden, it can help you. It is so the freedom of choice is so high here, and even these words like utopia, it was only my understanding. And because his verses are like a mirror, and every reader will have his own understanding, another reader will have another one. Saadi's difference with them is that he, even with all honesty, he's not even prescribing. I'm saying he's prescribing. He never ever said, if you do this, that'll happen. If you do this, that'll happen. He mentions stories. And in the stories,
Exactly.
I interpreted it as that.
And that's the difference between prescription or
treatise.
laws, and laws basically, and stories. That's the distinction. And that was exactly my point, that I didn't see that. That's why I don't even call it rose garden, because that has a implication of everything in the garden are roses. It's a flower garden. It's Golestan, and we can have other flowers as well, not only roses. So that's
thorns and worms and other
and cacti, and cacti and everything.
Cacti, undesirable creatures there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that was exactly my point. So
and you're right.
And
actually,
finally,
flower garden is better. I agree with you. Flower garden is better.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my last question, I want to give the floor to our dear friend Mustafa too. I want to talk to you for the whole day about this matter. It's very close to my heart, Saadi and his ethical work. But the last thing is that along the side of this talk of reconciliation, and also about the model of Saadi for a good city. Aristotle, at the beginning of his Nicomachean Ethics, says that politics is an architectonic art, meaning that if you are offering a treatise, not a aesthetic work, not a Golestan, but if you are offering a formula of politics, it has to put different institutions so that it brings in like an architecture, like a building, where by putting arts, he says, into a harmony, then we have we maximize happiness for everyone. That's the meaning of being architectonic art. Politics put other arts into a harmony so that it brings happiness for everyone. So, and that's what Aristotle calls it, justice, or reconciliation as justice, But now I want to bring you to a part of your book where you bring a story. So you have different stories, and in most of the stories, some of the stories, at least at the first part of Golestan, Saadi, in offering the model of justice, he acts like a counsel to the kings. Most of the principles that you mentioned, it seems that they come handy in the hands of the king, rather than bringing all arts together in harmony. It seems more like Machiavellian prince to how to tame the subjects into submission. So the many of the stories that you say says, be a shepherd to your people, not a wolf. And this example of a wolf comes more than 12 times only in Golestan. It comes more than 12 times. Only this analogy of the wolf, that the king to its people, it's like a shepherd, not a wolf. And if you're a wolf, you'd better die, right? Rather than so. Although these all make sense, if you have that model of the time of Saadi in mind, if you have a civilization, Iranian civilization of Anushirvan, and before Islam, Iran, or Caliphate Iran, right? If you have that makes sense. But to bring that to a community where we don't have kings, we don't want to have kings, we don't even want to have religion ruling us, autocracy and theocracy. We don't want to have these, right? So how do you think this is translated into a kind of reconciliation?
If I understood the question correctly, my answer would be that, well, Saadi has brought the genre Mirror of Princes, this genre, which was in Middle Ages Europe or Renaissance, this genre of he has brought it. And as you say, he has counseled the people, the elite in power, at times much more than the subjects. So one reason I can say he intends to counsel people who can do something. This could be because of he is injecting a practical element to his writing, and he knows he can achieve more from people in power than people who have no power. He wants to bring a mirror of princes genre, like the book Prince. Now, the next one is even interesting for me, is it could be Sadi's Islamic influence. The saying, I don't remember the Arabic, but the translation is, if you want to correct a people, correct their regime first. This could also, because he is Muslim, he's devout Muslim, and this could also have affected Sadi. If you want to correct a people, correct the regime first. This plus the mirror of princes genre, which he might have been inspired by a Western writer, and the practical nature of, if you actually do want to make change, why not make change to people who can do something about it? If
So
I
you
didn't
think
get
that
your
he
question,
doesn't?
please.
Yeah, no. My point is that if he is humanist, he has to believe that every human can do things for themselves, and you as human, like Rousseau, you have to stand up and be responsible for your prospect and for your future, right? So, but he doesn't do that. Most of his counseling is to the kings, and how to be a good king. Even in one of the stories that you mentioned it yourself, that he's more strategic in establishing the law, and he even advocates for expanding the law to have more power, or more more extensive reach, but never to actually disobey the law or completely dismantle the government. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. After the Mongol invasion, he was one of the people who, according to at least the studies I did, he did not advocate rebelling against the Mongol rulers, because this is very interesting actually. He maybe he believed in the Hobbes, is it? I think it's Thomas Hobbes, the secret doctrine between regime and people.
Exactly.
I forgot the name, the contract, I forgot the contract.
Social contract, yeah.
Yes. This came up actually in my studies. Whether he believed in that or not, I don't know. Whether he simply did not believe in rebellion against the Mongols because he knew how much bloodshed would be spilled is another thing. But one important point I have to add to what you said is Sadi's humanism is not like Rousseau's. Sadi's humanism, again, this is the person speaking right now who has studied him, another might be different, is more in preventing and reducing suffering. That's his humanism. His humanism is not that type of you are responsible for your actions, man up, stand up, and because his humanism is more into reducing human suffering and increasing human well-being, it is different than Rousseau's. And he knows if he can change even a little bit in regime, in government, he can do much more than foment a huge rebellion against the Mongols. They'll just create suffering. But if he can make even a small change in the government up there, he can achieve more. His humanism is different than Rousseau.
Thank you so much, Iman John. Thank you, Mustafa John, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Dehghani.
Thank you, Hessam Aziz. Thank you, Iman John. Thanks very much. So very interesting conversation. Iman John, I know that, well, the audiences have also posted some questions. I'll very quickly ask my question, but I don't need, but I wouldn't require expect you to answer me now, please. So let's go through that. But before I forget, I'm very much intrigued, right? If you were going to, by the way, your topic is very bold, actually. It's very bold, might be controversial in some parts, to be honest, but very much worthwhile, I would say, even pursuing further, and for the reasons that I humbly suggest. So if we are to extract somehow the reconciliatory thought of Saadi, right, and translate it into political philosophy for the modern age, as you mentioned, right? Why restrict ourselves to his Gulistan only, right? Why not holistically and comprehensively go through his other works as well? That's my first question. And the other one is your argument, as I read it in the introduction, comes across as a little bit too much anthropocentric, right? Like this almost ultimate emphasis on just humans, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. His humanism is like that. Yes, the end is the human. The means lead to human.
Okay, so that's interesting if you have that answer for us, because my question is, as a follow-up on that, first of all, like for the audience who might not have had a chance to take a look at the book, so here's a segment from Iman John's book where he recaps his argument. So the quote, "The current book holds that the Rose Garden is designed by Saadi to point the way towards a higher, more developed human state based on integration. Unlike the many commentators who see the Rose Garden as a practical manual for getting by in an imperfect world, the current book sees it as a blueprint for transforming human outlook by showing people how their lives could be radically improved through paying more attention to the most important things that matter to their well-being and survival, that is, or namely, each other," right? And so I would like to just, remind ourselves that there is some work also being done on the significance of nature and animals in Saadi's work. So do you think that your attention to these aspects of Saadi's work would have made you sort of modify your main argument? Because again, if it's going to be a philosophy that is of use to people of this day and age, our global conflicts also have to do with nature and animals as well, right? So please have these in mind, if you don't mind. And I would like to go through some really interesting questions that have come to us by the audience. The first question is also very much related to a question that we had received, excuse me, upon registration by another registrant, and both have to do with translation. So in one way or another, these two somehow ask the same question or different aspects. So here's the question, one of them: has anyone translated Saadi's books into English? How is the quality of the translation? And if you don't mind, the other one is, who or what is your favorite English translation or translator of the Rose Garden? Thank you.
Yes, Saadi's Rose Garden or Flower Garden, Gulistan, has been translated by many, from Brown to Rahatsek to not just English, Russian, Turkish, Arabic. The best translation, the translation I used, I translated Saadi's verses myself because I was interpreting them, so I wanted to use my own translations. However, I did in the footnotes put translations by Edward Rahatsek. The reason I used Rahatsek is because the English is easier. It's more clear for any type of audience who is not specialist in literature or Iranian studies or history to enjoy and understand it. Edward Rahatsek's translation has an added benefit that it is, if I may, more aesthetic than the rest of the translations. For example, when you look at the rest of the translations, there's a mechanical nature to them where every word is being translated for its own sake. While you go to Rahatsek, every word is being translated in relation to Saadi's mind, or it's not alone. The words are being and the verses are being translated in relation to, in my opinion, this is strictly my opinion, in Saadi's life. Sometimes you see a translation, it doesn't, by Edward Rahatsek, it doesn't fit the literal translation even. But then when you read the story, that's why he translated this way. And I chose Edward Rahatsek. There are many. Brown is another one, which I think was the first one to come in English. But there are so many. Some of them are truly mechanical. I use Edward Rahatsek for its aesthetic nature, flow, and ease of English. But in my book, I repeat, I use my own translations.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Iman John. The issue of translation came up in our previous talk, which also happened to be about Sadi, although mostly Sadi's Ghazaliyat. So it seems that you're more in favor of some sort of translation that is not literal or word by word, but has somehow, well, all translation, as you also mentioned in your book, is some sort of interpretation, but you are in favor of more interpretive translation.
Yes,
so let's
exactly.
go. Thank you, Imanja. So let's go to the next question by an anonymous attendee. They ask, quote, often poetry is written about personal feelings or interpersonal relations. Can this be translated and applied to a political context and even to international relations? For instance, comparing dynamics between governments to dynamics between individuals. How so?
Wow, that was the whole that was the whole issue that came up. Yes, extrapolating something from small to large or transposing something from poetry to politics has its own very difficult challenges. Roland Bleecker has written a book on aesthetics and global politics, which really helped me when I was writing my book. And he shows a rhythm, a music, if you will, between political dynamics and interpersonal relations. In easy terms, every human having relations in society is not much different than every country having relations in the international field. There is even one theory in international relations which looks at every nation as having a behavior similar to humans. And that paradigm in international relations looks at state behavior like human behavior. There are other paradigms that look at it as a machine, as many other issues, but this one is the one I like. A state, a human entity like a state, doesn't have to be much different than a human, two people in a local market arguing about something. So, and the book by Roland Bleecker, who is an international relations expert, but the book is on aesthetics in global politics. He describes this, that all political actors are human entities, whether it's a political party, whether it is a organization, and when you extrapolate them, yes, in magnitude it'll be different, but I guess in quantity it'll be different, but in quality, not a major difference, at least in my angle.
Thank you, Manjan, for being concise, given the time we have. Although we definitely try to answer all questions. So the next question comes from Aryan Zand, a dear friend. Thank you very much for being here, Aryan Jan. So Aryan mentions and asks, quote, thank you so much for your presentation and for keeping Alireza's memory fresh in our mind, with an emoji like this. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what a coherent and unique theory of international politics based on Sadi's Gulistan would look like. You mentioned that you do not see as much contradictions in Sadi's writings. Does that mean that if we distill Sadi's logic into a set of propositions, we can then have a unique explanation for how the world of international politics works or should work?
I'll definitely say this is the golden question of today. Definitely the golden question of today. Yes, this has come up before. There is a statecraft model called the welfare state, which is used by Scandinavian countries. That is the closest model I have seen today, from the models being used today, that closest to Sadi's thinking. The welfare state in the Scandinavian politics is used, and where the end is the human, the citizen. That is one. One more, which might even be closer than the welfare state, but it has not been used in any state so far. It is the social and political thought of the British idealists, such as R.G. Collingwood. And they believe the state's ultimate aim is human development and human self-knowledge. It's human self-knowledge and then developing it. I would say that the political thought of the British idealists first. Second, welfare state used by Scandinavian countries. These two would be the closest. And thank you for the golden question.
Thank you, Iman John. As a follow-up on, you're mentioning that Aryan's question is a golden question. Just to let you know, of course, I would definitely respect all of these questions, and I'm not saying whether I agree with you or not. But Aryan knows how much I love him as also as a political scientist. So by training, he's a political scientist. And among others, by the way, Iman John, he has taught a course on Machiavelli. So perhaps that's why he was here to see, what you want to do with Machiavelli. Anyways, thank you very much, Iman John and Aryan Aziz. So another anonymous attendee's question, quote, would it be fair to say that Saadi's vision of utopia is not meant to be realized, but as an archetype or ideal to inspire us?
Oh, wow, that's, yeah. The silver question of I'm gonna Olympics, gold, silver, bronze. Yes, that has come up, frankly, with me and the discussions I had with Iranian scholars when I was doing the field work in Iran or in Europe. I'm going to be honest, no one could give a concrete answer to it, whether this is an end goal that is, we're meant to just go to this direction, or no, this is a real achievable entity. Whichever one we believe, it is worth it. Whether we believe, no, it's just a road, hopefully we'll get there. Saadi didn't mean we're going to become living side by side in harmony. He just said something that we can hopefully be inspired by it. Still, better than the situation we have today in the world, or whether it's achievable. I would go with the achievable one, but then again, I'm idealistic. The more realist colleagues said it is more of an inspiration. This has come. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman John. By the way, we are very grateful to you, Iman Aziz, because we know how late it is where you are right now. You're in UK, correct?
1:30 in the morning.
30 in the morning?
1:30.
1:30 in the morning. Wonderful. So again, we are especially grateful to you. So the last question, I guess, I'm just trying to go to the, yes. So, okay, so Hakime Kadivar, another dear guest, has asked, what is the name of the book? Where is it available? And I think that has been answered by Connie. So the title of the book for our presenter, Dr. Iman Ahmadian, is New Insights from the East on Poetry and Politics, the Reconciliatory Thought of Saadi Shirazi. And where can people obtain that book? Which I know that it's not that inexpensive.
It's, yes. And the publisher, I really didn't want it. It's Edwin Mellon Press. Edwin Mellon Press. And actually, that is the name of the dissertation. The name of the book with me here is Saadi's Rose Garden as Political Literature, a 13th century Persian poem. So I repeat, Saadi's Rose Garden as Political Literature, a 13th century Persian poem, and by Edwin Mellon Press in New York. You can also, the last part of my surname, Cherkawani, the search is much easier. Cherkawani. That'll make the search easier.
It'll come up.
It'll come up easier, yes.
Thanks for correcting me, right, for like with the title of the book,
no.
Iman John. And I just want to make sure that I'm not unintentionally excluding any. Yes, we have just one more comment by Nikki Rod, who mentions to, oh, maybe I was not supposed to mention because it's just sent directly to host and panelists, but it's a note of thank you. So this was, they mentioned this was an excellent and very informative talk, a marvelous example of interdisciplinary work. Thank you. And thank you, Nikki. So at this point, I would like to ask Iman and Hessam, if you have any final remarks, please go ahead. And then afterward, I'll do another thank you to all of you, and of course, the audiences.
Thank you all, Connie, Mustafa, Hessam, thank you for the insightful questions. Special thank you to, was it Aryan Zand for the golden question? Yes, thank you for that, because that came up specifically in one seminar. And thank you, Dr. Dehghani, Connie, Dr. Abdul, everyone, and most of all, thank you, Alireza.
It's been a pleasure. And by the way, now mentioning Alireza, I would also like to mention that Hamid Ahmadian, the late Alireza Ahmadian's brother, was also with us today. He is actually. Thanks for joining us, Hamid Jan. And so at this point, I would like to also thank our audiences very, very much for staying with us until this minute. During the past two lectures, and including this one as well, we're going a little bit over our usual time, but for good reasons. So at this point, I would like to ask, thank you, Hamijan. Thank you very much. I saw your message. I would like to ask our audience, if you have time, please do take this 2 to 3 minute survey, because it really helps us in terms of improving the lectures. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that Dr. Ahmadian has also allowed us to mention his email address. So he is welcoming any questions or comments you might have, follow-up questions or comments on his topic, his book. Feel free to be in touch with him. And finally, please do join us in our next lecture, the last lecture in the series of Fall 2021, which is going to be held on Saturday, December 18th. And by the way, one of the participants over there is also with us today, Dr. Pegah Shahbaz. Thank you for joining us, Pegah-chan. So the title of our next talk will be The Hidden Story of 1001 Nights in Persian, Muhammad Baqir Khorasani's Tarjumeh Hindriye, patronized in Hyderabad. Our presenter will be Mehdi Ganjavi and Meysam, I hope I'm not wrong, Muhammadi, I guess. And of course, our discussant will be Dr. Pegah Shahbaz, as I just mentioned. So we look forward to having this talk and also to seeing many of you over there. Iman Jan, Hessam Jan, thank you so much. Connie, thanks ever so much for your continued help and support. And have a wonderful rest of your day or night, wherever you're located. The audience says thank you. Bye-bye.